All right, we are in Judges. We started Judges last week, and we're only going to spend 4 weeks in Judges. And I think there's over 20 chapters, so we're not going through all of it. We're jumping ahead today to chapter 6, and we're going to read about one of the two more famous judges. Today and next week, we're going to be talking about Gideon. And then the 4th week in Judges, we're going to talk about Samson. So the two names, if you don't know very many judges' names, most people know something about Gideon, something about Samson. And if you don't, well, you're going to learn something. Because we're going to talk about Gideon this week and next week. And then Samson the last week. And then after that, we'll spend 2 weeks in Ruth, which totally different book, and yet it occurs during the time of the Judges. So we'll take a look at that as we go through here. I showed you this last week. This is an outline of the book of Judges. And just a good reminder, last week we were in the first section, which is just the first couple chapters. And I told you then that if you only had 1 week to spend in the book of Judges, chapter 2 that we were in last week is the chapter to be at. Because although it doesn't have all the fun details to read about, it gives you the overview of what happens. And so we'll talk about that overview again. But we've got, depending on how you count some of the names in here, you got roughly 12 judges. And so we're not going to skip over the first 4. I'm actually going to mention them just briefly, just to see the pattern. It is going to continue. And then we'll talk about Gideon today, Gideon next week, and then in 2 weeks we'll be at Samson, and I'll probably at least touch on some of these others just so you know a little bit about what happened with them. Some we know a fair amount, some we know almost nothing, as is the case with one of them today. Here's our cycle of judges I put up there the last week. And remember we said this was in chapter 2, but we're going to see this repeated over and over and over again. They start out serving the Lord, especially right after the death of Joshua. You still see the people are serving the Lord, but then they fall away from serving the Lord. There's sin, there's idolatry. The idols that were in Canaan, Baal and Ashtoreth. Then they become slaves. Now sometimes it's not all physical slaves, but they're in subjugation by the various nations around them or within them. Finally, when they get desperate enough, they haven't totally forgotten God, and so they cry out to him. And God, in his mercy, he raises up a judge. He raises up a judge, and that judge delivers them from whatever nation is oppressing them at that point in time. And then we repeat this all over again. It's like they don't learn. And so they repeat over again. And that's what we talked about last week. And that's what happens judge after judge after judge, repeating that again and again.
We don't always remember either.
Which is why this is a good lesson for us. Well, in my prayer I said, this isn't just a history lesson. We're human beings just like them, and we're prone to the same things. I'm glad you mentioned that, Carolyn, because we're all prone to that. We can get caught in this. I could see myself there a number of times over my life. Well, I told you I would touch on the first 4 judges before we get to Gideon, and I abbreviated the verses, and I thought, I'm not even going to read them all. I'll just give you the story of what happens. But a few of the verses are here. But I'll read this first part. It says, the sons of Israel, and this is chapter 3, sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth, who we talked about last week. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of the king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served him 8 years. So we're starting our first cycle of the judges, right? They were serving the Lord, then they fell away. Now they're serving the others. And what happens? God loves them too much to leave them where they're at. And so he sends another king along, a king of Mesopotamia. They serve him for 8 years. And they're under subjugation to him. Well, that's when the first judge comes along. And this first judge is actually a nephew of Caleb, Othniel. He's a nephew of Caleb. I won't read all this, but he's a nephew of Caleb, and God calls him, and he musters up some of the people of Israel, and God leads him. They go against this king of Mesopotamia, and the Lord gives them into his hands, so he prevails over them. And then the land had rest for 40 years. And so that's what we see happens with these judges. They have rest for 40 years, but then eventually, like everyone else, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And so what happens after the judge dies? We read here in verse 12, now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Almost word for word, right? It's just happening all over again. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And the sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. So it's happening all over again. Now they're in subjugation to another king. Well, that takes us to our second judge, Ehud. And so I'll read this first part here to you. When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, they finally got to rock bottom. The Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now you might wonder, why in the world would it reference a left-handed man? Anybody here left-handed? Okay, we got two. That's pretty much typical. You got a room of people like this, a small percentage are left-handed. Same was true in apparently the days of the judges. Now, Ehud was been raised up as a judge, but they're still in subjugation to these
the king of Moab.
Yeah, the Moabites. Yeah, king of Moab. And so his responsibility then was to go into the king and pay the taxes that are being asked of the Israelites at this point in time. Well, he decides, God has told him that he is supposed to overcome this king. Well, normally, and I imagine the kings had Secret Service. They probably didn't call them Secret Service in those days. But if you're going to come in and see the king, you're going to see the Secret Service first.
Right.
Now, if you're right-handed, you strap a dagger on your left leg. And they're wearing, these flowing robes. And so, if you're right-handed, you sneak in, you grab your dagger. Aha! Well, so I'm sure all the Secret Service checked everybody's left leg. What they didn't think about was there are a few left-handed people that are going to strap the dagger on their right leg. And that was what the case was with Ehud. They had never checked his right leg for a dagger. So he goes in to see the king and to bring the tribute money. And all the while, he's got this dagger hidden on his right leg. Well, after he gives the tribute, he says, King, I have a special message for you, but it's a private message. So the king, he's caught off guard. He says, okay. And so he sends all of his other men out of the room. They lock the door. But what does he do? He reaches in, he grabs a dagger on his right leg, thrusts it into the man who is, they said, a rather heavy-set man, and he sticks it into his belly, and the king dies. Well, nobody else knows it because the doors are locked. He apparently sneaks out a back way, and as the king, nobody wants to interrupt him. And it says after a while, the story is kind of almost humorous. It says after a while, his men are wondering, well, why isn't the king coming out of his chambers? And they're saying, well, maybe he's relieving himself. We don't want to interrupt him while he's relieving himself. They continue to wait. After a while, they finally say, well, we've waited long enough. There must be something wrong. They open the doors. King's dead. Well, that gives Ehud lots of time to escape. And I won't read all of this, but he eventually escapes and he musters some of the armies of the Israelites, and they go and they rout the Moabites. And so it says, so Moab was subdued that day under the hands of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. So they have peace there during that time. But what happens? Eventually, the judge is going to die, and the people go back in, and we come to another judge. Now, this judge If there's any of the judges we know very little bit about, it's this one. He has one verse, Shagmar. And here's the verse. We'll go ahead and read it. It says, after him came Shagmar, the son of Anuth, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. So we don't know much about him, but we know he's a judge. We know that he has delivered Israel from the Philistines. Anybody know what an ox goad is?
It's a pole with a thing on the end of it.
You got it. Here's a picture of what one might look like. Basically, they're a pole, 6 to 8 feet long, wooden pole, and they got some kind of metal thing on the end which you use to goad an ox. And you would use that when you're plowing. It's not. This is your John Deere. And so how do you make sure your John Deere is going the right direction? Well, you use your ox goad to help, or if it stops, and it stalls out, that's how you get your John Deere going again, your oxen. Use your goad. Well, it's an amazing thing to think that here he struck down 600 Philistines. Imagine many of these might have been military men with an ox goad. And although it doesn't say it, how do you think he was able to do that?
God's
God did it.
With God's help. You're right. You're right. I don't know how you do it. Yeah, chopping them, but with God's help. I can't, no matter how good of a ninja warrior he would have been, the 600 men, and he came away as a live man, saved Israel. Well, then we come to our fourth judge, Deborah, a woman. And it says, the sons of Israel, again, so this is a repeat, did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died, and the Lord sold them into the hand of the king of Canaan. And so once again, the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. So now they've been in subjugation for 20 years. They're oppressed severely, and they raise up Deborah, who's actually a prophetess. And Carolyn, you asked this question last week, and I mentioned that the judges primarily were military leaders. However, not always, and not always all the time, because here we have Deborah, who's a prophetess, and she's judging Israel. So maybe she's a little more like what we traditionally think of a judge as someone who is got cases brought before them. And I can picture her as a prophetess. A prophetess would be someone like a prophet who is hearing the word of the Lord. And so maybe they're recognizing that she is hearing from the word from the Lord. And so she is helping to then use that word of the Lord to judge cases. And so people are coming to see her. And so interesting that I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, the idea of prophets or prophetesses, even at this time in Israel's history. But the story on this one, everyone is unique. Everyone is interesting. God tells her to summon a military man by the name of Barak, or Barak, however you want to pronounce it, to go and fight against their enemy. He says, only way I'm going is, Deborah, is if you go with me. She says, well, I'll go with you, but because you didn't trust in God yourself to do this, you're going to get the victory, but it's going to be by the hands of a woman. And so you can't brag about it at all. And so sure enough, it tells us that they do fight against them, and they're successful, and Barak is able to rout a lot of the army. But the commander of their army is a guy by the name of Sisera. This is the commander of the enemy. His name is Sisera. And so they're all running for their lives. He flees to an area where there's some Israelite people, and she motions to him. She sees him come and says, "Come on, you can hide out in my tent." And so he goes and hides in her tent. Well, he's totally exhausted. Says, "Can I have a drink?" And she says, "Well, I got some fresh milk here for you. Milk helps put you to sleep anyway. I've been told. I don't like milk myself." But she gives him a glass of warm milk. Probably not a glass, but whatever you put it in those days. And then he's totally exhausted. So she says, lay down here and I'll cover you up with a blanket so nobody will even know you're here. And he falls asleep. And what does she do? She grabs a hammer and a tent peg and puts it through his skull. Pretty gruesome.
Yeah.
Pretty gruesome. But that's what she kills the commander of the enemy's army. So Barak, although he's rounding a lot of the army, he can't claim victory because it was a woman who killed the commander of the army. And then, of course, then she calls the others in. Look who I got in here. And they see that, and so the enemy is totally defeated at that point in time. And so it tells us in verse 20, the end of that chapter, so God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the sons of Israel. But we know who accomplished the greatest victory was the lady in the tent. Well, the next chapter, chapter 5, which is just before we get to, is a song. And Deborah and Barak have this song. And so the whole chapter is a song of recounting their victory. And the last verse ends that chapter, and the land was undisturbed for 40 years. So that's all before Gideon. So that finally we get to, but before we get to it, I want to show you a couple things. I thought this was interesting. I hadn't thought about this before. So as I looked at this, I thought, well, who did Israel serve during these first 4 judges? With Othniel, it was the king of Mesopotamia. With Ehud, it was the king of Moab, the Moabites. With Shagmar, it was the Philistines. And with Deborah, it was the king of Canaan. And I thought, well, this maybe shows a little bit of a picture of what's going on in Israel at this point in time. If you think back, when the Israelites left Egypt, who is their leader? Moses. That's right. You had a nation of Israel. You had a national leader, Moses. After the death of Moses, who was the leader of the nation of Israel? Joshua. That's right. So he's the leader. But after the death of Joshua, we don't have a national leader. We have 12 tribes, and the families of those tribes would be leaders. Just like in this country before the Revolutionary War, you didn't really have a nation. We had 13 colonies. Each colony kind of stood on its own. Sometimes they worked together. Sometimes they worked against each other. Same was true with the 12 tribes of Israel. No national leader. And so while we read about these judges, it's helpful to note that these judges may not be judging the whole nation. They were more or less a judge over a tribe or two. And so there could be some overlap with some of these judges. While the king of Mesopotamia maybe attacking more of the eastern tribes, same with the Philistines would be more of the southern, western tribes. And so there could be some overlap. So when you see some of these dates in there, don't think, well, one follows the other consecutively. There could be some overlap. There most likely was. The one other question I thought was a good reminder, who fought the battles for Israel with these first 4 tribes?
God did.
You got it. God did. And you can see that by what it said. With Othniel, I bolded, the Lord raised up a deliverer. The Lord came upon him. The Lord gave the king of Mesopotamia in their hands. So who really fought the battle? It was the Lord. It was God. Same with Ehud. We see when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them. Now the third one, Shagmar, didn't mention the Lord, but I already asked you earlier, how could one man defeat 600 Philistines with an ox goad? 10 would be saying something. 600, that had to be God. That had to be God. And then with Deborah, we see once again, she gives a word from the Lord, and she says, basically quoting God, I will draw out Sisera, and I will give you into his hands. She's saying that's what God is saying. He's going to do that. And so this is something I've been talking about through Joshua and through Judges, is as they're moving into the promised land, as they're now living in the promised land, maybe they've been here 100 years now, certainly at least 75 years, whatever. God says, as you're going in, who's fighting the battle for you? He is. God's going to fight all your physical battles, but along with that, there's some spiritual battles. There's some spiritual battles to be fought, and you Israelites, you need to fight those spiritual battles. You need to decide what God you're going to serve. And unfortunately, they're making the wrong choices. And they're not winning those spiritual battles, which means then God is not going to fight the physical battles for them. So just a reminder there. And so that's where we've seen now, let's go through 3 or 4 times through this cycle that we talked about with our first 4 judges. Now that takes us to our lesson for today. So I've already spent almost half the time just on previewing, but I hate to skip over anything. You know that. And so, Donna, would you mind reading for us these first couple verses?
Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord handed them over to Midian for 7 years. The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds.
Thank you. All right, it sounds like you were just repeating that first line up there, weren't you? Once again, they're doing evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord does exactly what he said he was going to do, hands them over to somebody else. This time it's a different power. It's the Midianites. And where do they end up having to hide? In their towns, in their villages? No, they end up in caves, in dens, in strongholds. Certainly not a very comfortable place to live. Might be good for the rain, but other than that, that's a tough place to try to survive. And yet that's where they happen to be. Well, then it continues on and says, for whenever Israel had sown, the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the people of the east and march against them, so they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, nor a sheep, an ox, or a donkey. Now, in those days, there was no HEBs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have somebody that comes in, and the Midianites were known as kind of nomadic people. They were marauders. And so they come into the land, all over the place here. They're wiping out the crops. They're taking your cattle and your other livestock. How are you going to eat? It's tough. You got to try to hide whatever little bit you got in your caves or your dens. It's not a good way to raise crops. That's not a good way to take care of your livestock. And I'm sure after all these years, they're getting hungry. There's no fat Israelites at this point in time, probably. They're barely making it. They're surviving. And so it says, for they would come up with their livestock and their tents. This would be the Midianites, the Amalekites. They would come in like locusts in number. Do they have, and I've only lived here a few years, do you have the 17-year locusts that come here? Okay, you don't have it. In certain parts of the country, there's what's referred to as the 17-year locust. Any of you ever heard of that?
Yes.
Okay, because you've lived in other parts. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's different years in different parts of the country, but in that 17th year, when they come up, we have a few locusts every year, but they come up all over the place, and they're everywhere. They're on the plants. I've tried to pick strawberries and crops during those years, and you lift up a leaf. They're on your plants. They're eating your produce. They cover the trees. They eat about the last 2 years of growth off of every tree. If you plant a new tree, they pretty much wipe that tree out. And they are loud, because you know what one locust sounds like. Can you imagine thousands of them? And then after they lay their eggs and they die, there are shells everywhere all over the ground. I can remember driving probably about 5 years ago through a section up near Columbus, Ohio, and I was driving a shuttle van, and splat, 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 they're just splatting all over my windshield. Well, that's what you got here. These are coming up like locusts in number. Both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to ruin it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. So once again, we got that same cycle. They've rejected God. And God has sent in the Midianites, and they're starving. They have to be starving. And so finally, when they hit rock bottom, they finally remember, oh yeah, what about God? And so they cried out to God. And so we see the cycle occurring once again here. And we're about halfway through this cycle down here where they're crying out to the Lord. Well, Dawn, you want to read what happens next?
Now it came about when the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of Midian, that the Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. It was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors. And I drove them out from you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not obeyed me."
Thank you. Thank you. How many of you have heard the story of Gideon before? Okay, some of you have.
Gideon, yeah.
Yeah, some of you have. I've heard this story since I was a kid. I went to church my whole life, and my mom told me Bible stories, and so I heard the story of Gideon. I had never noticed about a prophet here before. And I got to thinking about this, and it just shows God's mercy and his grace towards his people. Because in those days, they didn't have the Holy Spirit like we do today. They occasionally it would come upon someone for a period of time, but not like that. Everybody didn't have a Bible in their homes or in their cave or their den. So how did they hear the word of God? Well, God sent prophets. And so they still had opportunity to hear the word of the Lord through prophets. And so we have an unnamed prophet. We don't know his name. We get to heaven, we'll find out what his name was. But we have this unnamed prophet, and he's coming to the Israelites, and he's speaking a word from the Lord right here. And I like how you emphasized it, Dawn, because he says what God says, and he says, "It was I," meaning God, "who brought you up. It was I who rescued you from the Egyptians. I drove your oppressors away from you. And I am the one who spoke to you, saying, you shouldn't have any other gods before me. You need to follow me. I'm a jealous God. And you shouldn't fear the gods of the Amorites." Now that word fear, I looked that word up in the Hebrew. And if fear can be read one of two ways. You can be afraid, and sometimes that word means fear and the fact of being afraid of those gods. But I don't think that's what God was telling the people. The other way that it's used quite often is to have reverence for, to revere them. The word is translated awesome a lot of times. And so God is saying, you don't need to be revering these idols of wood or stone or gold. They're not awesome. I'm the only one who's awesome. I'm the only true God. But what happened? But you've not obeyed me. And so we've seen that he's telling them, look where you're at. You're at all because you haven't obeyed me. Think about what I've done for you and what you've done for me. And so just a reminder, like you were mentioning, Carolyn, a reminder, we need to be reminded of that. When things are going good, what do we tend to do? Forget God. And maybe it's not forget God, but we don't spend as much time praying. We don't spend as much time reading his Bible. What were you going to say, Peggy?
I taught a ladies' Sunday school class back in Virginia, and we had this thing, you put God up on the shelf.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And when you need him, you bring him down.
You're right. And we usually don't need him till all of a sudden we're in trouble, right? And then all of a sudden, oh yeah, remember what I got on the shelf? I got on the shelf. And that's pretty much what's happened here. And so this prophet has come along and said, you're crying out to the Lord, but look why you're having to cry out to the Lord. Look at what's happened. Look at all these things I've done for you, and look at what you've done to me. Good reminder. Good reminder. This is where we come to our first application in our text. You know, our study guide, we have apply the text, and I thought, well, this first one fits in right here. we can anticipate that when people turn their backs on God, and we really should personalize this, when we turn our backs on God, we experience undesirable consequences, which is the title of our lesson from last week, was consequences. And so those consequences are going to come. A term we sometimes use today is tough love. We do that with our kids. Our kids go the wrong direction, and instead of bailing them out, we sometimes let them reap the rewards of their poor decisions, and we call that tough love. And God's giving us tough love when He allows us to suffer the consequences of our poor decisions. So just a good reminder, we still deal with that today. And God has to give us some tough love because He loves us. Because He loves us. Well, let's go on here now, and we're finally getting to our judge. Donna, you mind reading that one for us?
Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, valiant warrior."
Thank you. All right, we have Gideon beating out wheat in a winepress. Now you might wonder, what's beating out wheat mean? That's a term that's used to describe harvesting wheat. And some of you were here when we talked about harvesting back, 6-9 months ago. We said harvesting in those days involved 3 steps. First step was when the grain was ripe, you took your sickle and you cut the stalks of grain. That's step 1. Step 2 is you got the stalk of grain and it's got a shell on it and a kernel inside. Well, the kernel that's inside, that's what you want. That's what's called the meat of the grain. Well, how do you get that out? And that's where step 2 is. And there's various ways to get that out. Gideon's using one of the ways, and he's just taking this grain. He's got maybe a whole thing, and he's just banging it on the ground. He's beating it on something hard, and that's hopefully going to break that loose. An alternate way would be maybe to take something heavy. Maybe even have an ox, and you have your ox treading on the grain. Well, the reason you're doing that is because an ox is pretty heavy. Or you might use a millstone. Some way to try to break that loose. That's step 2. But the third step in the process of harvesting, we had using the sickle, we had busting it up, then you take a winnowing fork, 3 or 4 tongs, you throw all the parts up in the air, the parts that you don't want, which is the shell, the long piece, that's light. The part that you want is heavier. And so the idea is you throw it up in the air, a breeze comes along and blows the lighter parts just a little bit off to the side. The heavier parts, which is what you really want, stays there. Which is why a threshing floor was normally on a hill. For example, I'll just tell you about one of them. You remember where the temple of the Lord was built in Solomon's day? It was built on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah. That's a hill. Well, what was there in David's day before Solomon? It was a threshing floor that was there. Years before, when David was king, that was a threshing floor. Makes sense. Threshing floors are going to be on high areas. So Mount Moriah was originally a threshing floor. Well, where is he?
He's in a wine press.
He's in a wine press, opposite of a threshing floor. He's not up somewhere high. He's out down somewhere low. Why? Because he doesn't want the Midianites to see him. Because if the Midianites see him, they're going to come and they're going to take what little grain he's got here. Well, what's going to be the quality of the grain that he's doing? It's going to be poor. I was thinking, an example that came to mind was, I like peanuts. I like them in the shell. I like them out of the shell. But you go to the store, you can buy them in the shell in a bag, right? Mm-hmm. You can go to the store and you can buy them shelled in a can or a tin can or in a jar. But imagine you went to the grocery store and you bought your peanuts, and in that jar was all kinds of parts of the shells in there. I mean, you'd have to be having a tough time picking those peanuts out. You're saying, wow, this is really poor. That's basically what he's doing here. He's creating a wheat, and it doesn't matter how many times he throws it up, because he's down in a wine press, he's getting very little breeze, And so along with the grain that he wants is still going to be a lot of the junk.
Yeah,
Chaff,
all
it's
the
called.
chaff is left.
Chaff, that's right. Chaff was the word that's used. And so probably a lot of fiber in their diets. A lot of fiber in their diets.
I'll fill them up because I don't have much.
You got it. You don't have much to eat. And so, I mean, it's better than nothing, but poor quality food at that point in time. And yet that's where we find Gideon in this story. Is he's doing the best that he can based on the circumstances. Poor food is better than no food.
And he's hiding out.
You got it. He's hiding out. He's hiding out against the Midianites still. The Lord, before I show you that one, the Lord, first thing he says to him is, the Lord is with you, valiant warrior. And I'm thinking, valiant warrior? You know, he's hiding because he's afraid of the Midianites. But then I thought of this verse in 1 Samuel. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so, what do we see here? We don't see a valiant warrior, but there's something that God sees in him that he doesn't even see in himself. And that can be true with us too. God knows who we really are. He knows what's inside of us. That's going to play in what's going to happen in just the next few verses. God calls him a valiant warrior, even though that's the last thing he sees of himself. But God knows who he really is, and he knows who we really are. Well, that takes us to our next verse. It says, then Gideon said to him, that's after he was called a valiant warrior. He says, oh my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did the Lord not bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian. I thought, wow, he's asking that question, why? And why has all this happened to them?
They did evil.
Yeah, that's right. We can go back to the very beginning of this chapter, where it says the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You would think that Gideon would recognize this, but it almost seems like Gideon is totally oblivious to why they're there, because he's asking him why. Why hasn't all this happened? Why do you think Gideon might be asking that question, why? Think about if you're in a situation like that, or you know somebody else is in a situation like that. If you're in a desperate situation, whether it's health-wise, whether it's financially, whether it's family-wise, things going on, and all you see is all of the trouble around you, we tend to have blinders on in those kind of situations, don't we? We don't see what else is around us. All we see is our pain and our misery. And that may be what Gideon's going through right now. He's forgotten what God has done. I mean, he hasn't totally forgotten. He's brought it up here. I remember the stories of old, how God did all these things, but look at what's happened to us now. And you tend to have forgotten. How did they get there? Well, they did what was evil in the sight of the God. And as we'll find out actually in next week's lesson a little bit, there's even idols in his own home. They have Baals there. They have Ashtoreth right there in his own home. But he's tend to have forgotten why that's happened to them. Another thing I thought about, that word abandoned up here. So he said, the Lord has abandoned us. And yet I went back to what we looked at last week in chapter 2, where it says the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook. Not the same word as abandoned, but doesn't that pretty much mean the same thing? Mm-hmm. So it's like what goes around comes around. What you've done is what God's now doing. You forsook the Lord, or you abandoned him, literally is what you could say. And so God has abandoned you. And you just see the justice of God. He is always a just God, and he is giving them exactly what they have given him. Fortunately, he's also got a mercy, and so he keeps sending these judges, and now he is going to send Gideon. And the Lord looked at him, and I thought this was interesting. God is not going to chastise him for his question why. As a matter of fact, he's actually going to ignore that question and get to the heart of the matter, which God always does. He looked at him and said, "Go in this strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you?" And I'm thinking Gideon's probably thinking, in this strength of mine? I'm in a wine press. What kind of strength am I showing as a warrior here? And yet, as we said, God saw something in him that he did not see in himself. And so we come to our second application of the text in our study guide, where it says we can be encouraged to know that God calls unlikely people to do great things for him. Gideon certainly looks like an unlikely person, right? And Gideon is going to reinforce that, what he says next. But God doesn't always use the strongest, doesn't always use the smartest, doesn't always use the wealthiest. He uses the people he wants to use. There's one verse that he sometimes even uses the foolish to shame the wise. And so God's going to use Gideon to do some great things. And then just to make sure, and I'm giving you a sneak preview of next week, just to make sure Gideon doesn't start to think of himself more highly than himself, God is going to do some amazing things in when he uses Gideon to defeat the Midianites. Pretty much like how Shagmar used one ox goad to defeat 600 Philistines. God's going to use Gideon the same way. Okay, we get near the end of our section, and it says, "But he said to him, O Lord, how am I to save Israel?" And then this is where he starts listing off all of his qualifications, or lack of them. He says, "But behold, my family is the least in Manasseh." So we know he's from that tribe. "And I am the youngest in my father's house. Yet the Lord said to him, I will certainly be with you, and you will defeat Midian as one man." I noticed the two I's in here. The first one is what Gideon says. How am I to save Israel? He's still focused on what can he do or what can he not do. And what does God say? I will certainly be with you. So it's not all about you, Gideon. You're just a vessel I'm going to use. But it's I, the Lord, who's going to accomplish this. And that's what we're going to see next week in the story. God's going to use an unlikely person. It comes to our third, apply the text. Believers should trust God when being called upon him to take a specific action for him. And we got just a few minutes left. I was sitting in a class where somebody taught this Sunday, and they asked the class the question, can any of you think of a time in your life where maybe God asked you to do something that you didn't think you could do, or you didn't want to do, and yet he did something miraculous out of it? When he asked us that question Sunday, it didn't come to me till after the class. I thought of something for myself. I don't know if I ever told that story in this class, but when I was young married, had a young family, attending church, and you think about what ways can I serve in church. And one of the things I thought that I absolutely did not want to do is work with little children. I did not want to work with little children at all. I would never volunteer for nursery duty or helping the little toddlers in whatever. But there was an announcement one Sunday where they said, our fourth grade boys class could use some help. And so they have a teacher, but they could use another helper in that class. Well, I had a son in that class. My oldest son was in that class. I thought, well, maybe I should go there and help out with him, be a little spiritual guidance for him. So I contacted the church and said, I'll help out with them. They said, well, fine, come to the Sunday school office next Sunday, and they'll get you lined up there. So that Sunday, I come to the Sunday school office, and I say, okay, I'm ready to help out. They say, good. We need help in the 4-year-olds class. And I thought, Wasn't it fourth grade?
Fourth grade.
And then, no, it's the 4-year-olds, and so I don't know if I misunderstood or if they misspoke or whatever. And so I know this probably only lasted a second or two, but I had a million thoughts going through my head as I stood there, and I'm thinking, the first thought is, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't want to do this. I don't like working with kids. And so I can just tell them, sorry, it's not for me. But then, and it probably only lasted a second or two, all these thoughts going through my mind. Then I'm thinking, God knows what he's doing. And I may have made a total mistake here, but he knows what he's doing. And so I'm just going to suck it up. And I'm going to go in there, and I did. And I probably didn't have a smile on my face when I went into that class. At least I'll try it 1 week. And I went in there, and they got the little tables, the little chairs, and we talked about that in the beginning. I'm a little guy, and I fit right into those tables and chairs, and I had the time of my life. I was just helping the teacher, and maybe I'm just 4-year-old in my mind still, But we had a lot of fun that day, and hopefully they learned something in their Bible story, and I made it hopefully an enjoyable time for the kids. And 2 years later, I found myself in charge of the entire children's church.
Oh my God.
And we had up to some Sundays 100 kids. And I was in charge of all of that. And it never would have happened had God not directed me into something I totally did not want to do. And so I felt like I was a Gideon there. I wasn't equipped. I didn't even want to do it. There were a lot of people that were more qualified than me to work with those 4-year-old kids. But he was equipping me into doing something I never thought I would ever be doing. And I loved working with the children's church. For 2 years, I think I did that, because I was the leader of that. So you can think about things that where God may call you. You may think, well, here I'm living a grand living, but who knows what he might call you to do. Maybe there's somebody that new that just came in. You could sit by them and befriend them. Maybe there's somebody who's been a little antagonistic. We can talk to them. Maybe there's something that God's put on your heart that I need to start this. Maybe a little prayer time once a week with some friends, or who knows what. I'm in a different Bible study besides this. And so who knows, if God's put on your heart, he'll supply what you need. Just like he supplied with me. I didn't think I had what it took. But if he calls you to take a specific action, do that, because when he calls, he supplies. And that's our lesson is called. And so when he calls, he'll supply what you need. So just as a reminder, we can anticipate that when people turn their backs on God, they will experience undesirable consequences. We talked about that earlier in the lesson. We can be encouraged to know that God calls unlikely people to do great things for him. And Gideon's certainly not the only example in the Bible. Think of David. He was the youngest and the smallest in his family, and yet God called him to be a great king. And then what we just talked about, believers should trust God when being called upon to take a specific action for him. And I don't know what that is, but he's still calling. You're still here. He's got a job for you to do, and it may be something you totally didn't think about. Any comments about the lesson?
Well, I don't want to say this, but at the end where it says Bible skill,
Yep.
I looked up all those people.
Did you?
And it's throughout the Bible. And
It
is wonderful.
So it's
in all the verses, the Lord calling people.
Yep.
And anyway, I was interested how it just went right through the Bible.
It is amazing. Now, so if you don't have a book, see me, I'll get you a book.
I would recommend doing that.
Do the extra work. You're right. You will benefit from doing that. I kind of go through it, and I teach what I think the Holy Spirit's taught me, but great additional information.
It was just a challenge to look them all up.
Very cool. Very cool. That's going to be, there's all kinds of things in your study guide that I haven't even touched on. So thanks for mentioning that. You'll get so much more out of the lesson
What
if you do
lesson
that.
is that, Carolyn?
It's
What
on
number?
page 89.
Okay.
And it said, scripture is full of calling experiences where God selected servants to carry out his kingdom work. And it just starts with Genesis, Exodus, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Jonah, Luke, Mark,
Yeah.
Acts. It's just wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's why I went through and wrote it.
That's
down.
great.
So it just shows you how.
God calls.
Yeah,
And it's not always the smartest, the richest, the most qualified,
no.
but he knows. He knows what he needs and what he will use. And so we need to say, yes, Lord, I'll do it. I'll do it. Thanks. Well, next week, we're in chapter 7. So we're going to, and I'll even touch on the end of, I think chapter 6 gives the rest of the story of Gideon. So you're going to see when he's called, God is going to do some amazing things with Gideon. So if you don't know the story, it's a pretty cool story. And so we're going to go through that next week. The lesson is trust. Think of trust and obey. Gideon's got to obey, and he's got to trust God, and he's going to do some amazing things. Let me close this with a word of prayer, because it is after 11.